My name is Ken Bob. I serve as treasurer of the J Street Board of Directors and also as the national president of Amenu, the Progressive Zionist Organization. And I'm really thrilled to be here chairing this panel. I was asked to just share a few thoughts of why I'm here today. First of all, I'm actually a dual citizen of Israel and the United States. So the issue of shared values can actually be a somewhat schizophrenic experience. But actually, I have a very optimistic view about this tension or challenge we're facing around the shared values between Israeli Jews and American Jews. And I'm going to share three little vignettes from my personal experience. First of all, I have two children who live in Israel. They've actually chosen to live there in the context of something called the urban kibbutz movement. And they are, in a lot of ways, embodiment of these challenge of the shared values because they're working in educational, social justice type settings in order to find a way of implementing their values in Israel today. Secondly, I'm a member of a Reform synagogue in Israel that's located on Kibbutz Gezer. Some of you may have heard of my rabbi, Rabbi Miri Gold, who successfully went to the Supreme Court and won the right to be recognized as a regional rabbi. So there again is an example of our values really being played out. And last but not least, I just came back from a trip to Israel, and I was there when the infamous travel ban executive order was declared. And literally the next day, I found a message on Facebook calling for us to come demonstrate at the U.S. Embassy. So there I was, an American citizen, an Israeli citizen, and the person next to me, a very good friend of mine who some of you may know, the columnist for Aretz, Brad Burston, was holding a sign which said, Jews united against Bibi and Trump. And I think that really sums up a lot of what we're feeling these days as we struggle with this issue of shared values. And on that note, I'm going to introduce our panel. I'm going to introduce each of them very, very briefly. In the back of your program booklets, there's fuller biographies. First of all, let's see, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. Dahlia, raise your hand so everyone knows who you are, is a public opinion expert and an international political and strategic consultant who has advised electoral and civil society campaigns in over a dozen countries, in addition to 5 national campaigns in Israel. Yair Rosenberg, second from over here, is a senior writer at Tablet magazine, where he covers the intersection of politics, culture, and religion. Then we have Rabbi Noah Sattath, second from the end over there, is the director of the Israel Religious Action Center, the social justice arm of the Reform movement in Israel. And lastly, on the panel members, we have Rabbi Shira Stutman, all the way over on the end. She's the senior rabbi of Washington, D.C.'s innovative 6th and I Historic Synagogue. Now, before I introduce our moderator, this is the obligatory please silence your phones, put them on, turn them off, vibrate, whatever works for you. And lastly, we will also get to a point of Q&A, and when our moderator is ready, you can line up at the microphone right over there. Let's not make it a mob scene. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator, who is Dr. Dov Waxman, right next to me. He is a professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies, and the Statsky Professor of Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies at Northeastern University. His latest book, Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict Over Israel, is published by Princeton University Press in 2016. And with that, I turn it over to Dov.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. I was actually at the very first J Street conference, so it is amazing to be back here to see how much the organization has grown. To see all of you, to feel the energy in this room is really a wonderful experience, and I'm very happy to have the honor to be joined by a distinguished panel here to be addressing what I think is a very important question in thinking about the future of the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel, as well as perhaps more broadly the relationship between the United States and Israel. And that's the question of values. Very often when we think about the US-Israel relationship, the question of shared values comes up, that it's not just a relationship built upon common interests, but is also underpinned by shared values. And indeed, that's also true when we think about the relationship between American Jews and Israeli Jews, that somehow this notion that what unites Israeli Jews and American Jews, indeed Jews perhaps around the world, is a common set of values, often expressed in the famous slogan, "We are one," which I'm sure many of you recall. But that assumption, that belief in the shared values between these two communities, I think has been tested time and time again in recent years. We can see a lot of empirical survey data that seems to call into question just how much Israeli and American Jews have in common. In particular, in the surveys that have been conducted in recent years by the Pew Research Center, which you're going to hear probably a little bit more about, the survey that was conducted of the American Jewish community in 2013 and of the Israeli society in 2016, one of the things that came apparent if you put those two surveys together is the differences in attitude, the vast differences in many ways between these two communities on many issues. First and foremost, on the issue that many of us are here today to think about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the things that really struck me in that survey was the fact that for most Israeli Jews, it's not actually their biggest concern. It's not the biggest problem that they believe Israel faces, whereas it is, in the opinion of most American Jews, the biggest concern. Most Israeli Jews also have given up hope of the prospects for peaceful coexistence between Israel and a Palestinian state. Most American Jews, however, continue to believe that such peaceful coexistence is possible. On the issues of religious pluralism and the status of non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel, we also see in those same surveys different opinions, in particular the attitudes toward non-Orthodox streams of Judaism. And of course, when it comes to attitudes toward human rights, democracy, liberalism, the surveys also revealed starkly different attitudes. Just to take one example that was discussed quite a lot in the news, almost half of the Israeli Jewish public in that survey said they favored the removal or transfer or expulsion of Arabs from Israel. Now, it wasn't clear which Arabs they were talking about, but this is perhaps something we will take up in the questions. But again, that seems to be quite starkly at odds with the liberal values that most American Jews hold dear. So we have this survey data, raw statistical data, which suggests that perhaps there is a growing divergence or clash of values between American Jews and Israeli Jews. And so that's what I want us to be focusing on. And what we're going to do to get into it is identify three key areas to focus on the similarities or differences in values. The first one, the attitudes, the values concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Second, attitudes, values regarding human rights, democracy, liberalism. And then third, but by no means least, attitudes concerning Judaism, Jewish religion, Jewish practices, and particularly Jewish pluralism. So we have a wonderful panel here to address each of those things. And what I would like to do as much as possible is try and get a discussion going rather than just have each panelist give a mini speech. So I might occasionally interject and try and point out some areas of disagreement, if possible, because I know that always keeps things lively. So I'm going to begin, first of all, with the question concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and values that underpin Israeli Jewish and American Jewish attitudes and views about the conflict. And I'm going to turn here to Yair to begin with us. And I want us to hear your views on whether you think these two communities, American and Israeli Jews, share common values in their attitudes toward the conflict, or whether you see more divergence or a clash of values.
Hi. So first of all, thank you, Dove. Thank you, everyone here in the room and on the panel. It's an honor to be here. Let me know if you can't hear me. Yeah, I have something of a cold, so I'm going to move this as close to my mouth as possible. So it's really an honor to be here. Dove said he was here for the first J Street conference. The last time I was here at J Street, I was here as an undergraduate at like the second or third iteration of the student portion of the conference. So it's kind of a strange role reversal to be sitting up here. And I just wanted to say, thank you to all of you who are here, and especially the students, because I know it's not so simple to just pick up and leave school and come to something like this, and I know it takes a lot of effort, and I really appreciate that. I also know we're not going to get to address everything people want to talk about on this panel, but I know for myself, and I think several of the people here, will be circulating afterwards, and we'd love to talk with you afterwards. So as to the question, which is American Jews and Israeli Jews and their divergence on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there are some people here who are more suited to talk about poll numbers, who professionally this is what they deal with. I can tell you my experiences as a journalist who goes and speaks on college campuses to high school students, right, to community events around America, and the sort of things I hear, particularly from younger Jews. And hopefully it will resonate with the experiences of people in this room, and you'll correct me if it does not. What I tend to see, especially among younger Jews, are three different groups, two of which get a lot of press, and one of which doesn't and is largely underserved. One of them is this very large group of Jews who are largely apathetic to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Those people are not in this room. They don't come to events like this. They're the sort of person who I'm sitting on a train and we're having a conversation and I tell them what I do. And they're like, yeah, Israel-Palestine. I don't really, I've never been there. I have a cousin there. And you discover, oh, they're Jewish. A, B, they don't have very strong opinions about it. And it doesn't really play a very strong role in their identity. And very often this correlates with not being as affiliated with the organized Jewish community in any capacity. And there's a lot of concern and consternation in the American Jewish community over young Jews checking out, feeling less affiliated, less connected. That's not people in this room. That's not people in equivalent rooms on the right of this conversation. But it's a very large group, and they shouldn't be forgotten. There's also another group that gets a lot of attention because they get a lot of headlines, because they're interesting and unique and attractive to journalists like me, which are people on the very far left of the spectrum very often, who have basically reacted against what they see as a very strong, uncritical pro-Israel stance, often of their forebears, their parents, and their communities, and have gone so far in the opposite direction. They are in charge of BDS campaigns. They have very strong anti-Israel opinions to the extent of saying maybe Israel should not exist, things like that. Now, that's a really cool story for a journalist because here's a Jew who doesn't want Israel to be there. That's the sort of thing that's going to grab headlines. In my experience, it's not a huge portion of younger American Jews, but they are a real and growing phenomenon, and I wanted to mention that. Those are two groups you've probably heard quite a bit about. They pop up in the polls. People like to write about them. But the large group that I tend to encounter on college campuses in particular, walking into this room, several law students, and we were having a conversation, this came out again, is there are a lot of American Jews who are dissatisfied with the options they've been offered to talk about Israel. So you have people who, basically they immediately recognize several things. They notice that there are certain types of conversations where you enter into where everything Israel does that's wrong gets somehow twisted into something that's right. And then there are other conversations you enter into, other communities, where everything that Israel does that's good and right gets twisted into something somehow that's wrong. And they're not dumb, and they notice that this is going on, and they check out of those conversations. But it's not because they don't care about Israel, it's because they don't think those are honest conversations where they can have a nuanced view. And there are a lot of people looking for a space where they can talk about Israel, and sometimes it's hard because what are the groups that we have set up? They're all advocacy organizations. For the left, for the right, for the far far left. We have lots of organizations that engage on Israel in the American Jewish community in America, but they're almost all oriented towards lobbying and action and advocacy, which is great. But it means you can't really have a conversation necessarily because you're oriented towards getting something done, and eventually you have to fall in line behind a specific policy. So you can't have a talking shop, you can't quite have a think tank. And a lot of people are looking for that space. And I don't think that we necessarily have that right now. And I see it because I'm a journalist, and so I don't have to be on anybody's team. And so those people come up to me and they say, like, I appreciate what you do, but I'm fortunate because I don't work in that space. If I worked in an advocacy organization, I would be talking very differently about the things I talk about. That's one thing they notice. Another thing is that these sort of younger American Jews are looking for places where there are positions that are not allowed in these, the current discourse that we have. So you have some people who are, for example, I know the head of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, when I was an undergrad in college, was very, very, very strongly anti-occupation, spent significant time in the West Bank, was fluent in Arabic, and he was also very skeptical of the Iran deal. Now ask yourself what organization this person really fits into in the American Jewish community. And this person is very involved, and they're still involved, but they don't really have a place. And they're not isolated. I meet people like this a lot who don't fit into the boxes that we've created, again, often created by the necessities of advocacy, because if one political party has one plan, the other party has the other plan, and we create these particular mutually exclusive positions. And there isn't a middle space. Again, that's more of a think tank space, that might be more of a journalist space. But those people are often like left by the wayside. And again, I think there's a lot of them, because I see them, we see them a lot. I write for Tablet. We get a lot of mail, and we get a lot of people saying, the conversation that's happening here, and I'm sure lots of other Jewish publications get that too, is not something I can have in my hometown or in my local Jewish organization or even on my campus. One of the problems on campuses in particular, this is the third thing that I see with this group, is that these people want to have a discussion about Israel-Palestine without immediately getting typed and dragged in as foot soldiers for a particular cause. And I've talked with friends who are Muslim educators on campus, and they see the same thing, where young Muslim students might actually want to have a conversation with young Zionist or young pro-Israel students or young Jewish students, but they're told, no, you're not allowed to, or you have to have a particular stance, or if you dare to have that conversation, well, we assume you're like that kind of person. And the same thing is true for Jews who are on campus. If you start having certain conversations or speaking with certain people or being open to certain things, you get typed as a particular kind. You're really right-wing, you're really left-wing, right? You're on this team, you're on that team. And people then check out of the conversation because that's the conversation that's on offer. And so I think something that to keep in mind is like, how can we create spaces where all of these people feel welcome?
Thank you. Since you brought up the issue of young Jews, I was actually going to come to that a bit later, but since you brought it up, I'd like to now turn to Rabbi Scherer, who works extensively with, in particular, young American Jews, to maybe comment on some of the things that Yair said, and whether you think there are particularly divergent values between young American Jews, or let me accurately say maybe young non-Orthodox American Jews, because I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, it's really great to be here. I've been at many a J Street conference, but never from this side of the room. So it's really wonderful to get to see so many of you in this room for this important conversation. So I work at 6th and I Historic Synagogue, and for those of you who don't know what it is, I'm just going to give you one sentence on it. We are basically a spiritual center / Jewish community center / cultural center, primarily for the Jewish community, which of course nowadays includes many people who are not actually Jews, right? So for the Jewish community, people specifically in their 20s and 30s. And so I'm really glad about what Dov said. We really do not engage a lot of Orthodox Jews. The typical 6 and I, or what we say, is an off-the-bus birthrighter. So they are someone who went on Birthright, who went on Honeymoon Israel, which is like the new Birthright type of program for couples. Someone who might have stepped foot in Hillel maybe between once a month and once a year while they were in college. Like, I'm sorry to typecast if you are a 6 and I know you're much more nuanced than that, but sort of that's the type of person that we're dealing with. And when it comes to Israel, a lot of what Yair said, I agree with 100%. Our people tend to fall into 3 groups. If you ask them, are there shared values with Israel? Well, of course there are shared values, right? Because if I were to ask everyone in this room, or everyone who's coming to AIPAC in a few weeks, do you value equality? Yes, we all value equality. We value human rights, but it's only when we get into the nuances of how these values are actually put into place that we start to see some of the differences. So we have 6th and Iers, the young adults who are very much on the left, right? Who very much often see their opinion towards Israel as being connected to nationalism in general, right? And so the idea of borders and nationalism doesn't appeal to them, and so therefore the same goes for Israel as well, right? And so a lot of their feeling about the occupation is actually about their feelings tied up with their feelings about nationalism. And then we have our people on the right. Now, for us, the people on the right are still 2-state solution kind of people, but they see BDS, for instance, as by definition being anti-Semitic. And so, as Yair was insinuating, there's no conversation to be had, right? Once you want to open a conversation about BDS, we're done. But the vast majority of 6 and Iers are apathetic. And they're apathetic for exactly the reasons that Yair was articulating, either because it just all seems so complicated. And by the way, these are people who went on Birthright, right? I am not talking about people, if you look at the Pew study, the numbers of young adults who have been to Israel is relatively high. But they still feel like it's too much, there's too much information, I don't know who to trust. I was just talking to someone last week and he said, and this is someone, he went to Hebrew school, he met his wife on Birthright and married her, he said, I really love Israel, but it's not on the top 10 list of things I care about in this world. And so in general, like, those are the people that we get. And so when we ask questions about values, yes, of course they would say they share some of the values about Israel, but the values that Israel also shares with us. But when you try to drill down into what those values are, that they do or do not share, it becomes incredibly more complicated. So for instance, here's a nuanced question that would be perhaps difficult for some of us in this room to answer, but is not difficult for Six and Iers to answer, which is, all right, so if we have the value of democracy versus the value of a Jewish state, we're using the word value like very loosely here, right? But if we put up democracy versus Jewish state in this into your average Sixth and Ier, I don't think it would take them a very long time to make a decision. And I think they would choose democracy. And I think it's because of when their education from their childhood of what they grew up with, of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, right, comes into conflicts with some of the challenges to democracy that Israel is experiencing. It is still a democracy, but there are some challenges to it. They don't like to have, it's like a cognitive dissonance. And then their brain explodes, and then they're done. Which I have a lot of compassion for. I have a lot of compassion for. I think in order to be able to hold a nuanced view on Israel-Palestine, the amount of information and history and politics and statistics and empathy and compassion that you have to hold is tremendous, and it's just way too much for the average person. And so what we need to figure out how to do as a Jewish community in America is we need to figure out how to have these conversations step by step without creating red lines. Because the red lines, when, you know, for the way young people would draw red lines is very different than the way some of us in previous generations might have drawn them. And in that way, to bring as many people into the tent to allow them to have these values-based conversations in the ways that are comfortable to them, if not always to us.
Thank you. I'd like to bring now the two Israelis on the panel into the conversation here. I want to begin, first of all, with Dahlia. How do you see, as both an Israeli and somebody who's also come from the United States, how do you see these differences or similarities in terms of values, or particularly on some of the broad questions that we talked about, equality, democracy, etc.?
Well, I mean, I thought about just diving into the numbers, but I will start, since we're all giving our pedigree at J Street, by saying that I've actually spoken on, I don't know, even 3 or 4 conferences, so I'm just amazed you keep coming back to hear me. Thank you. So maybe I'll wait before jumping into the numbers briefly, and I'll say I think the major difference is that in Israel, you don't have the same sort of historic and symbolic sense of identity and participation in activities that involve human rights and civil rights. I think in America, the struggle for civil rights and minority protections has a long history for the Jewish community. They take pride in their participation in this issue, self-sacrificing participation in many ways throughout the 1960s, for example. Certainly not all of the Jewish community, but it's become mythologized as part of the collective experience. In Israel, there is not really a historic or symbolic collective memory of that sort, because Israelis didn't experience being the minority in Israel. And now we're of the generations that didn't really experience it in the past either. And of course, the experience of Americans who participated in that in terms of solidarity with those other communities in the civil rights era were doing so out of a sense that solidarity is important and, you know, universal values of equality are important, but also because of their own lived experiences as minorities in America. I mean, you know, the Jewish experience in America has been by and large fantastic, but of course, we had to go through many stages of it not being fantastic in order to get there. So that, I think that really shapes, you know, again, the collective and symbolic experience of the two different communities in very different ways. And for that reason, that influences how Israelis see the concepts that we're talking about. So I'm going to focus on civil rights and human rights. With that background, keep in mind that the idea of civil rights, which applies to things like minority rights, you know, protections, you know, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, voting rights, it's kind of a strange concept for them. They don't think about it that often. I know that they don't think about it too often because I've asked them in focus groups, what do you think of civil rights? And people say, well, yeah, it has to do with, you know, that we can say what we want. And it's very vague because it's not such a living problem for the majority of Israelis. It is for a minority of Israelis, but usually not the Jewish Israelis. And so they're not in the mentality of thinking like a minority. In terms of human rights, I think that's where we really see a major more stark difference. And this definitely relates to something that you said, Rabbi Stutman, about the difference between the theory of Israelis, who by and large, a majority will say that they completely support human rights. In a survey I did in 2011, 65%, nearly 2/3, of Israeli Jews said human rights are, we asked them to rate it positively or negatively. It's a typical thermometer kind of question. And they gave it a positive rating, a nice, clear majority. But when you ask them about human rights organizations, only 45% gave a positive rating. When you ask about human rights organizations defending Palestinian rights, only 21% gave it a positive rating. That was in 2011, and that was the good news. Okay, in 2016, we asked about the general concept of human rights. And among the Israeli Jewish sample, this is a survey I did for B'Tselem, by the way, only 45% gave a positive rating for the overall concept of human rights. So what's happened between 2011 and 2016 is that there's been, a significant delegitimization of the concept of human rights because it has come to be seen, by and large, as sort of reflexively associated with Palestinians working for the enemy, working for the people who are trying to kill us. And so that, it's divorced it from any broader sense of the grounding, the philosophical grounding of human rights that has defined sort of Western thinking, and underpins a lot of how we define democracy these days. And I think those are very fundamental differences. I will give one other interesting example before we go on to the next round, which is that if you want to understand the difference in very broad, and I appreciate what you said about categories. I think it's a real problem. There are many people who cross different categories and they don't find homes, and we are generalizing here. When I talk about majorities, I can say 65%. That's not 100%. There's lots of in-betweens. But if you look at how American Jews define themselves in the Pew survey that Dov talked about, and how Israeli Jews define themselves, you see a fascinating mirror image. I will tell you from the Pew survey, when they looked at American Jews, 49% considered themselves liberal. I'm not going to use their numbers on Israeli Jews because I asked the question differently myself. But in my surveys, I just took the most recent one, 52%. Okay, remember, 45% of American Jews say liberal. In Israel, 52% of Jews consider themselves right-wing. Okay, so polar opposite. 29% of American Jews consider themselves moderate. 26%, almost the same, of Israeli Jews consider themselves centrist. Among American Jews, 19% consider themselves conservative. And in Israel, about 17% of Israeli Jews consider themselves left-wing. So that does, and those mean something. In other words, when people give themselves those terms, they know what they're talking about. You can see it by looking at their attitudes, primarily on the conflict and conflict-related issues. So I'll stop there, but we are looking at communities that like to think of themselves as very closely aligned on that broad declarative level. But when you translate it into what it means for the issues we're talking about, I think we're heading in very different directions.
Thank you, Dahlia. I'd like to bring in Rabbi Noah here. And in particular, one of the things, we've talked about the political values and the liberal values, but in terms of Jewish values in particular, do you see your organizations in many ways trying to bridge some of those values? Do you see that as a discrepancy in values?
So absolutely, first. And I think that we have two layers of this question. The first layer, which I think is the most significant, I'll just, if everybody's introducing themselves, this is my first J Street conference. I'm in love and awe, inspired by all of you. And one of the things that I love so much about this conference, and I loved Jeremy's speech last night, was how he spoke about the threats to democracy and the threats to what it means to be Jewish. And I think that what it means to be Jewish in Israel for the majority of Israelis, for the majority of Israeli Jews, and also maybe for the majority of Israelis, and what it means to be Jewish here for the majority of American Jews is a completely different sets of values that are associated with those issues. And that is why many of the people on the Israeli left might not associate themselves with Judaism at all. And I saw in earlier panels today a lot of the discussion about how to rejuvenate, re-energize, reimagine the Israeli left. And I saw these inspiring leftist activists, and you will see are inspiring Knesset members tonight. And kind of, I was trying to imagine the people sitting in the room next to me, and I thought they must be asking themselves, why aren't these people winning? They're so great. And I think that one of the major responses is the Jewish question, because the right wing in Israel is using democracy and the democratic values and everything that it has to offer them in order to win, and they are using extensively the Jewish values and the Jewish language that serves their cause. And the left in Israel is using solely the democratic language. And so we have an amazing organizations and amazing political activists, but they're running on one foot, which is why it's so hard for them to catch up with the right wing that is using all of these two languages that are so intertwined in every Israeli discourse on every issue, from economic issues to refugee rights to the Israeli-Palestinian question. And so the basic question of the division between democracy and human rights and Judaism is something that we reject. But for Israelis, we as liberal Jews reject, but for Israelis it is confusing and complicated because Judaism has been possessed or taken away by the Orthodox monopoly that keeps telling them, we know what Judaism is, and Judaism means nationalistic, chauvinistic, misogynistic, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is a major question of difference, and also has implications on all of the layers of our discussions here at J Street. The second question is really the implications. So on my way here on the flight, I met one of the coordinators of an American rabbinic program. And we spent a long time discussing a student who is a patrilineal Jew, and she is miserable in Israel, and she has no place where she can be counted for a minyan, and how devastating, so she came to Israel in September, and how devastating and alone and alienated she feels by this. And so in these conversations, I offer all legal ideas, but mostly I listen. And as I was listening, I tried to ask myself, how will she feel when she returns to the US? I mean, she came from she came to Israel from a completely different country than the one that she'll be returning to. And kind of how, if we are trying to figure out a divide and how to bridge it, I think that we as liberals in both countries are for the first time in a long time, are experiencing ourselves as oppressed minorities in similar ways. And the stories are not completely linked in any way, but I think that we are beginning to form a shared experience that can be helpful for us if we are working to protect democracy as Jews in our respective countries.
So I just want to follow up, and I think it's a very interesting point about those on the Israeli left, small though it is, who are not necessarily driven, not looking at you, Dahlia, who are not necessarily driven by Jewish values in their politics, but rather by universal values. And I'm wondering whether, and this is probably maybe true for many people in this room, that many Jews on the left here actually are motivated very much by what they define as Jewish values. And in particular, for example, this notion that social justice is central to the values of many liberal American Jews in terms of their understanding of Judaism. And perhaps, Rabbi Shira, you might want to jump in on this.
I'm fascinated by what you just said, because I do think that look, there was actually in Yair's esteemed publication, there was an article a few months ago about, and I thought the article was a little bit overwrought and overstated the case, but Liel Leibovitz had some good points about how, to a great extent, progressivism is the religion of a lot of people. I don't want to put words in his mouth that he didn't say, that, the progressivism has become the religion for Jews who are sort of on the left, and that actual Judaism has taken a backseat or maybe is not in the car at all. And I do think that for a lot of American Jews all across the spectrum, but especially from the center to the left, the language of values is entirely, the language of their activism is entirely couched in Judaism. Right, the Judaism, the words that we all know, that even our president, well, our former president used, right, tikkun olam, we hear it all the time, and that's what Judaism, and justice, and so there's it is both selective, but it sort of represents the entirety of what motivates certain groups of people to be Jewish. It's the entirety of their Jewish identity, to a great extent, is their political activism. And I think that's problematic for me, by the way, as a rabbi, because I'm also trying to pull people back to Judaism as a religion. Don't tell Mordechai Kaplan, because he would want Judaism was bigger than just a religion. But we also need to remember to be grounded in Judaism as a religion, in addition to using our Jewish values to undergird all of our political activism. Whereas many of the people more on the right, as I experience it here in DC, their Israel activism is motivated more by a sense of tribalism, which is a little bit different than the sort of values Jewish practice orientation. Not entirely different, but different enough. And the language is entirely different because for people on the left, the language of tribalism is not meaningful almost at all, but definitely not to a great extent.
I'd like to jump in and offer a construct that's somewhat similar to that, but a little bit different to explain perhaps why there is a divergence in how American Israeli Jews relate to this issue. And so people often, basically, if you look at the reactions that American Jews and Israeli Jews have to Israel, your political activism, the question is really a post-Holocaust question. It's saying, we're an empowered Jewish community, what can we do? What is the lesson of this incredible, earth-shattering, insane event? What should it tell us? How should we conduct ourselves in the wake of this? And you have two very different responses. One of them is what you just said, the tribalistic response, which is saying you can't rely on the world to watch out for the Jews, because in the end, they will always throw us overboard. They will close all the doors, right, for us to flee to, and we can only rely on ourselves, and therefore we must lobby for a strong Israel in a very narrow sense, and that becomes our core primary value. And there are clear organizations here in Washington in the American Jewish community onto which you can map this. There are clear political parties and politicians in Israel onto which you can map this. Then there's a completely different, we'll call that the Sheldon Adelson viewpoint, right? Then there's at the extreme, right? And there are gradations all the way down, and we know very reasonable people, right, who have this as part of one of their motivating forces, right? And then you have a different reaction, which is to say the way you stop a Holocaust from happening again is by creating universal institutions and universal politics that ensure that everyone looks out for everybody else, and so a Holocaust is unthinkable again. And call that the George Soros response. Let me go and build universities across Europe. Let me fund civil society. Let me do all of those things. And you have these two very divergent worldviews. And they're sort of competing. And actually, in this moment right now, to a certain extent, right, people may blame, say, the Trump moment on the Sheldon Adelsons of the world. But the Sheldon Adelson people on the world will say, well, look, you guys keep losing, right? George Soros built a giant university in Hungary, and they're firing all the liberal scholars, and he is used as this bogeyman in Hungary as the Jew who controls all of the media and all of the various economic institutions and is the blame for everything rad that goes wrong in Hungary. So really, did your cosmopolitanism work? And so that, to me, I think, is really the fundamental divide in the American and Israeli Jewish communities, and one of them might be winning more in America, and one of them might be winning more in Israel, but it's really this post-Holocaust question that everyone is still grappling with.
I'm just developing an alternate theory of why this distinction that, I'm just thinking about it as we're talking, and I wonder if it doesn't have to do with the fundamental distinction between Israel and America, because Israel is a nation state in this classic 19th century, romantic sense where almost by definition, it's a particularist and tribalist concept. You're supposed to have some sort of overlap between the ethnos and the state, and Israel is founded on that, and Israelis who grew up in that bought into it and believe in it, and the system perpetuates it. Whereas in America, I said before, I argued before, I may be contradicting myself, that American Jews identified with the struggles of others because they themselves were a minority in America, but now I'm seeing it a little bit differently. Actually, I think America, is sort of a pioneer in this kind of development of a civic nationalism, where you have America stands for these values of universalist integration and creation of national identity that incorporates and accepts anybody who buys into it, no matter what ethnos they are. And maybe it's not exactly the Jewish minority experience of having been marginalized in America and that made them identify with other marginalized communities, but actually their success at overcoming it, because America allowed them a political framework to get out of that kind of marginalization and become extremely successful, and they see the potential and believe in what America offers in terms of that civic shared identity. And what I see is that maybe it's not so much the Jewishness that ties us together as our experiences in different kinds of nations that represent very different kinds of values. So maybe American Jews are just more American.
think American Jews are definitely more American. I mean, no, but I think we cannot overstate, you cannot overstate that, like, I just think, like, I am a rabbi, and I am more American to a great extent than I am Jewish. I think all the way to modern Orthodoxy, once you engage modernity, and modernity takes you. And so I think that's like a critically important point. I didn't mean to grab the mic.
But then the question becomes, does Judaism even bring people together?
Oh, that's a great
I'll let you
question.
take that one.
That's a great question. I think I just want to kind of to answer the bewilderment. I want us to imagine what it's like to live in Israel, where you're constantly faced with religious Jewish politicians who tell you what Judaism is, and they are constantly advocating for racism, for nationalism, and then that's what and surveys in Israel have showed it again and again, that the average secular Jew associates Judaism with racism, with misogyny, with homophobia, and most closely with corruption. And so why would you want to be associated with any of those values? And so how do we, and this is the contribution of diaspora Jews and specifically American Jews, how do we, how do you in partnership with us create bridges for people to see Judaism beyond that? But I would like to address your question about how Judaism connects people. And I think that the general idea was that Jews are not connected because we share values, but because we're a people. And we had this idea of Jewish peoplehood, and I think that the organizing element of Jewish peoplehood, maybe crumbling in front of our eyes as we speak, was we were all victims of anti-Semitism, and we will all stand by each other if we are experiencing anti-Semitism. And I think that the response of the current Israeli government to what is happening right now may be showing us that this organizing principle is less relevant.
I would say that what makes us Jews isn't that we all share the same values, but that we all share the same historical experience, right? And that's why when you bring up the Holocaust, people reacted to it extraordinarily differently. But we are all traumatized by it. We were all affected by it. It shaped all the institutions that we all align with now, and it shaped the different politics that we associate with. So that to me is more, and that's how the framework that I see, right? And that's how I can engage somebody who has very different views from me, because I see actually, right, you, Benjamin Netanyahu, you, George Soros, you, Sheldon Adelson, are actually reacting to like this incredibly epochal event. And I think what you said is it really gets at it in a certain sense, which is that America is a cosmopolitan experiment that, and maybe perhaps until this election, has succeeded. And so American Jews look at that and say, yeah, the cosmopolitan answer, it works, right? All we need to do is just keep spreading that out. And that was literally Obama's campaign rhetoric from day one onward. And that's why Jews really liked Obama. It made a lot of sense to them. Whereas a lot of Israeli Jews come from Europe. If you look at, like, say, the European Jewish communities today, they are more, I would say, to the right on Zionism questions than American Jews are. And again, it's because the European Union, in a certain respect, is a cosmopolitan experiment that is far less successful than the American experiment and keeps having problems. And it hasn't helped its Jews in the same way. And so you have very different divergent reactions, but it's all to the same real fundamental question.
So I just want to kind of wrap up this part before we turn to questions. I think it's, we've talked a lot about the differences and the divisions between these two communities. And, but you mentioned, Yair, the collective memory of the Holocaust. And clearly that is one of the things that does connect Jews in the United States, Jews in Israel, and Jews around the world. And one of the things that's quite remarkable is despite all of the differences between these two communities, and we've talked about all the divergent values, it is still remarkable that 2/3 of Israeli Jews, and at least in the surveys, believe that they share a common destiny with Jews in the United States. And 2/3 of American Jews still believe that they are attached to Israel, that they're connected to Israel. So despite all of the differences and despite the very different circumstances that these two communities find themselves in, despite the different historical experiences and different collective memories, the fact is that there is still this sense of commonality, of this shared fate. Whether that will change, I think, is something that we'll have to wait and see. But I want to now turn over to questions. I want to invite members of the audience. We have 15 minutes of questions, so please line up quickly. And please try to ask a question rather than make a speech or a political statement. And that way we'll be able to have as many questions as possible in the time. So, yes.
So, I'm much older than you. I was born right after the Second World War, before the founding of Israel. And what you haven't talked about, the Holocaust apart, is Jewish history. The history that I learned in the 50s and the 60s was of just starting about 200 AD, was continuous persecution. Jews would do a little bit better. They would be killed. They would be run out. They fled from one place to another, and it all ended up in the Holocaust. And Israel was going to be, we were going to do it differently. We were not going to do the things to other people that they had done to us. And somehow that's all disappeared, at least in Israel. They're doing all the same things. You can't marry, you can be killed in the street, your house is torn down, you have no rights, you have a different passport. All of that is different. And how come, I mean, that was in Israel in the 50s and the 60s. At least that's what they told us. And it's gone. And it's not gone from us, but it's gone from Israel.
Is there a question?
Yes, that's a question. Why has that happened?
Good question.
Okay, why has that happened? Who wants to take that on?
Unless you say it hasn't, but that's not how it looks from here.
We'll just pass the microphone all the way down the table, and then it will come right back.
What we can do is actually maybe we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll
And maybe they'll have comments.
Yeah. So if you'd like to come up, and we'll take 3 questions at a time, and that way we can, the panelists can choose which ones they want to respond to, or respond to all of them. Yes, thank you.
Hi. So recently I was in a discussion where I had a friend talking about the rise in anti-Semitism post-election, with a lot of bomb threats on Jewish community centers, and someone else who was not Jewish tried to convince us in saying that so long as the U.S. supports Israel, anti-Semitism is not a threat in the U.S. So my question is how to communicate to other people the distinction between being pro-Israel and being pro-Jewish, because I think they're very different, and I think that especially for a lot of Jews don't have the best or simplest relationship to Israel. So how you can communicate that being pro-Israel is not the same thing. Being pro-Israel does not exempt you from anti-Semitism.
And also that pro-Israel is not necessarily one thing that you would imagine.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. My question is with regards to the Jewish people who are on the far left, who are either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, or the people who are apathetic towards Israel, but do feel Jewish. How do you bring them into a Jewish America that's so much so tied to Israel, and its institutions are so tied to Israel? How do you create those spaces?
Okay, so we have a question about Jewish history and Israel's relationship to Jewish history, a question about anti-Semitism and the distinction between pro-Israelism and being pro-Jewish or not anti-Semitic, and the question of how to bring in other Jews into the Jewish community. Who wants to?
What I like about doing events with Jews is that they always ask such softball questions. So, I mean, I'm not going to try to answer all 3 of them because we have a whole panel. I'll pick up on something. This is something I deal with a lot, right? Which is the distinction between being, say, pro-Israel, right, and being not anti-Semitic, which I think is a really valuable distinction. And also just the notion, where does anti-Semitism fall in terms of Israel when you're pro and con? Does it relate to anti-Semitism at all? So for one, if I'm confronted with someone who says to me, well, look, the United States is so pro-Israel, how can there be anti-Semitism? Well, there are plenty of anti-Semites who like the idea of Zionism, including at the earliest years of Zionism in America, if you read the history books, because it was their idea of where to put the Jews. Because we don't want them here, but we can put them in their own country and we don't have to deal with them. That's the old graffiti. Amos Oz, the Israeli author, writes, when I was a kid growing up in Europe, they would put graffiti on the walls that say, Jews, go back to Palestine, right? And now in Europe, the graffiti is, Jews, get out of Palestine, go back to Poland, right? And so what's really going on is that people just don't want Jews. And so that's one response, which is to say that anti-Semites have a special interest in moving Jews elsewhere. I'm trying to think. There's a second one, but I'm going to leave it because I'm going to hand it down.
I may regret this, but I think I'm going to try to work on the history question again. Also because I wanted to give a partial response here. I think the original question is sort of why would people who experienced all this oppression over the course of our entire history and who swore we would never do that then become the kind of people who do that? Well, you know, as somebody who studies, and I work in many other countries that have dealt with conflict or are still in conflict, I mean, it's not that uncommon that people who experience the oppressed side of a conflict, right, who are victimized and oppressed, often just repeat the behavior. I mean, it's the same thing in families where there's an abused child, and you know that happens. Recently, just a couple days ago, I was talking with somebody who had interviewed, one of the people who built the military government system, which governed not the Palestinians, but the Arabs inside Israel, Palestinians of Israel from pretty much 48, 49, 51 through 66, and they said, why would you implement these kinds of laws against them when the British did this basically to you before that? And he thought about it and said, it was what we knew. So, I mean, that's part of it. It's your experience, and so you repeat it. But I do want to try to consider, again, this question about does our history as Jews really unite us, and is the history that unites us really the Holocaust? Is that the only thing that brings us together? It wouldn't be a shock, because many national identities are rooted in a national trauma. That's not unusual for Jews or Israelis either. But I think that there are so many moments in, this thousands of years of Jewish history that people can choose from and lock into certain elements that will influence them differently. First of all, never mind that the Holocaust is interpreted in many, many very divisive ways. The particularist, it only happened to us, the Jews, or the universal. There are genocides that need to be monitored and prevented everywhere. But go further back. What about the people who say, well, the defining moment of Jewish history is the destruction of the Second Temple and the movement of the rabbinical court to Yavne, where Judaism became a thing that was divorced from material, aspects to the codification into laws, ethics, morality, something that was immaterial and movable and resided in people's spirit and the community and the synagogue. Maybe that's a defining moment for some people. Or there's another defining moment with the state of which the state of Israel has made a big part of the national mythology, certainly in the early years, and that's the redeemers of the temple. The Maccabim, who came and fought, or you can call it the Netanyahu version of that, is those who would slay Amalek at every chance they get. In other words, only strong military might will defend the people. Those are all elements of Jewish history that can be brought into the narrative and have been very consciously, self-consciously brought into the narrative. And so I'm not sure which of those is the dominant force that unites Jews these days, but I don't think it's the same between Americans and Israelis.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm a gay Orthodox Jew, so I have a foot in the progressive community, and I also have a foot in the Orthodox community, or the more religious community. And so, for me, this isn't necessarily something I see that unifies us, but it's something that I see that could unify us, and I was wondering what your opinion was. Something that, I see a lot of people on both sides, they deeply question themselves, and they also have a deep sense of responsibility. And I think something maybe that, we're very passionate people, and even when I disagree with someone, I can respect how passionate and dedicated they are, and so I was wondering what you thought about that as a new idea of a unifying force.
Firstly, thank you for speaking. My question has to do with the growing divide between, I think, what Yair said about young Jews and maybe Jewish institutions. I think there exists an implicit, notion that Jewish institutions, mainstream Jewish institutions, will support whatever Israeli government is in power, and that might be kind of isolating, and that has been isolating for a lot of young people. But I'm also, a lot of people are aware of the fact that a lot of institutions are run by donors and donations. So how can we reconcile a populace that has different, preconceptions and ideas surrounding specifically Israel than the donors who are funding the institutions? So like primarily on campus or whatnot? How can we engage in these conversations? Because it's really tough when we can't, permeate the actual institutions if the donors are saying otherwise.
Okay, I'm a little short to reach this. Hi. So mine's it's going to come together into one question. Just bear with me for a moment. So you talked about young Jews checking out. I believe that was Yair. I believe that was you that started. And, we've got that about 80% rate of Jews kind of drop out of Judaism after their B'nai Mitzvot. And then Rabbi Shira, Rabbi Stutman, I don't know what you prefer, you were then talking about how Sixth and I was going back, and I don't think you meant it in a bad way, but you talked about how a lot of Jews are not actually Jews. And tying into that, you've got the whole Jewish history of, in America at least, of being involved with minorities. And, I'm from Atlanta, and we have the temple, which was bombed during the Civil Rights Movement, and the whole shebang. But then we talk about coming into Israel, and we look at settlers is probably the term that you would use, just because you've got the American Jews who came in, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, as not right-wing Americans, but as Jews who supported a Jewish state and who came in and built the moshavim and the kibbutzim, which were as communist and socialist as you could pretty much get. So how do you think that evolved from those Jews coming in who supported these ideas, not of Judaism as an overarching theme, but as a democracy and as a place that Jews could find a home without isolating other people, and how that evolved into a religious right that's so isolating of other people?
Okay, so we have some very big questions here, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that we only have a few minutes left to cover them. So I want to maybe bring in Rabbi Shira here to talk a little bit about, in particular, the question of how do you bridge the gap between the interests of donors and institutional power, if you like, versus the needs, the desire for young Jews in particular to have an open, uninhibited, not rule-bound conversation, particularly around Israel, but about Jewishness in general?
I didn't want that question. Okay. So when I'm not working at Sixth and I also serve as the scholar in residence for the National Women's Philanthropy of the Jewish Federations of North America. And so I spend a lot of time on Federation missions. And if I tell you that's atypical for a J Street supporter, that would be the understatement of the year. I spend a lot of time with donors, and I think it was Jordan, the person who asked the question, and I think that is really the $60 million question, whatever the number is up to now. Because I think there is a tremendous disconnect. If you're asking me the question about how to bring into the community people who consider themselves non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, that answer I can give you on one foot, but I think you already know it. It's with dialogue, it's with compassion, it's with open arms, and the ability to make changes in your own opinions, by the way. But if you're asking about the disconnect between the lay people and the donors, that's as tough as it gets. And here's what I would say. I would say whenever possible, get the people who are the activists in the room with the donors. The disconnect is tremendous. I told one of the women on the mission I was on 2 weeks ago in Israel that I was going to the West Bank this summer on Encounter to talk, and she said, why would you want to talk to them? Now, she's not representing a federation. She's one person, right? But she's a donor, 6 figures a year to Federation. So what we want to do is to get people in the room with each other. Do not walk away from the Federation system just because you disagree with a lot of what they do and say. You are abdicating your own seat at the table as left-wing people. A lot of our $900 million a year still goes through the Federation system. As people who are more left-leaning, whatever side of the position you find yourself, more towards the left, I find that we often tend to walk away quicker than the people on the right do. We are less open to dialogue than people on the right because we are correct, right? We think. So I would beg you, don't do it. Stay in the difficult conversations, whether it be with your grandparents, or whether it be with the Federation donors, because that's the only way that we're going to bring ourselves closer together.
So Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that there's not nearly enough time to have all the conversations we want to, or for all of us to address all the questions that you've given. So please, please, please come over. That's why we're here. We're not here to pontificate at you. We're here to have conversations. So I just want to say that, and I'll hand it back to Dov.
Thank you. So do we have time for, okay, very quickly, if you have a couple of questions, and then I want to give everybody on the panel a chance to make a final closing remark. So yes, you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenberg, you spoke about this paradigm of post-Holocaust, either universalism or tribalism, and basically in a post-Holocaust framework, which resonated with me very much. And you also talked about how Jews don't share values, but a historical narrative, tying that also back to the Holocaust. I was wondering if when we address also Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, how do they fit into that paradigm, and do they fit into the same Jewish historical narrative, or does that add nuance to it?
It's a great question. One of the fascinating things to observe on the ground in Israel is how Holocaust commemoration works, especially in schools, which have, you can have up to half Mizrahi students who don't share that historical period. Not all, some Mizrahi Jews did suffer in the Holocaust, but a lot did not. But they have their own historical traumas. And there are, in fact, some Israeli schools that now do alternative Holocaust trips which explore the Mizrahi narrative, and those are worth looking into, and those are things that American Jews can learn from because we don't acknowledge the Mizrahi experience nearly enough. I also would draw on what Dahlia said, which is that we share experiences far beyond the Holocaust, right? There's a narrative that reaches far, far back. The tricky thing is, of course, is that everyone interprets every single step of that in different ways, emphasizes this, lowers this, but once you realize that that's what's going on, you realize there is a conversation happening. You read Hanukkah in a different way than I read Hanukkah, but we both have Hanukkah, right? And there is true going back to so many different moments in Jewish history, and I find, again, that's a very useful framework for having these conversations. Writing a tablet, I see that a lot, that we can have the conversations around these sorts of things because we share the experience, even if we don't interpret it or emphasize it in the same way.
Hey, thanks again for hosting this panel. Found it really interesting. Yeah, fair enough. All right, so anyway, I'm gonna try to condense my question for sake of time. I found the discussion and topic of institutions very intriguing, especially in terms of the institutional response. So I guess I'd be interested in hearing you guys talk about how we sort of engage in sort of institution building to promote greater sense of understanding and unity within the wider Jewish community across different gaps.
You want to take another question?
So the question was about how to promote institution building to overcome some of the gaps and divisions. We have very quick, and then I'm going to have to make, I'm afraid we're out of time. I know we have a lot more questions, but I want to give everybody here a minute, if you can, to summarize your remarks. And before I close up, I'm sorry we're out of time. But if the panelists would want to add a closing observation, remark, or not, please.
So a lot of this panel has focused a lot on divisions, right, and things that keep and divide Jews apart, whether in America or in Israel. But I hope I tried, and I think some things that come out of what we talked about is that there's a lot that actually unites a lot of Jews and that we share. And it's just that we're fighting about how we understand it and how we react to it. And once we can recognize that we have this sort of shared framework, it can enable sorts of conversations to take place that we've had trouble having until now. That comes back to your point about the left running with only one foot, right? When there's this entire religious tradition and experience that the left can marshal and should marshal, right, if they're going to succeed in Israel and in America. It's all there. It's waiting for that conversation to happen. And so the answer is to have more of the conversation and not to check out of it.
Okay, I know I have very little time, but I can't resist giving you a few more numbers because they're really interesting. I think one of the biggest divides that I can see, and really probably the most outstanding difference that I saw in the Pew data, was that when asked how important is each of the following list of items in your Jewish identity, among American Jews, 69% said that leading an ethical and moral life was essential to their Jewish identity. Among Israelis, only 47%, so fewer than half. The second point is that for American Jews, 49% said that being intellectually curious was essential to their Judaism. Among Israelis, 16%. And I hope you're not going to laugh at that, because it really, living in Israel for 20 years, you feel that these two elements really express the culture shock that I feel actually every day for 20 years. And so what I think my final word is if I have one recommendation for how to change the situation, American Jews enjoy a unique position of credibility in Israel. Come to Israel, not only to learn, you should come to learn and see the situation for yourselves, but come also to teach. Tell Israeli Jews what you stand for and what you believe in, and show the small minority of embattled progressives that they have supporters in you. We want to hear it, and we need the help.
So 2 points. One, I think I want to disagree with Yair and say that although there are things that unite us, I am not sure that focusing on these different interpretations of the same events is what we should be doing right now. I think that we should be looking at liberal Jews here and liberal Jews in Israel and figuring out how we, as two groups that are not the full Jewish people, work together rather than try to, not instead of, but that should be our focus, and not the focus on trying to reach beyond these groups that are certainly now in a very, very important struggle for democracy. The second point that I wanted to continue what Dahlia was saying, and say that Israel is the largest Jewish project of our time. I think that American Jews correctly say that it impacts them, because it impacts every Jew around the world. And it's a unique time in history where we get to figure out what a Jewish state means. And these are the conversations that we should be having all the time. Is a Jewish state a state with a very large Jewish majority, or is it a state that opens its borders to refugees fleeing genocide? Is a Jewish state a state how do we create a state policy that views every person, the person in Gaza and in Sderot and in South Tel Aviv and in the border, everyone is created in God's image? What a challenge. And that is the conversation that every Jew around the world needs to be having. And this will inspire the Jews in Israel who are not still engaged in that conversation to think about it and to phrase it in those terms. And I think that this is one of the catalysts that will bring change in Israel. So I join Dahlia in inviting you not only to come to Israel to learn, but also to offer the Torah that you have created here around Judaism and human rights and civil rights and equality that you can bring and share to us.
So I heard the journalist Jamel Bouie talk a few weeks ago that he was talking about racism, but he said here in America we're like really very concerned with people's feelings. Is someone a racist? Is Donald Trump an anti-Semite? But what we should be more concerned with are people's actions. And so when we're talking about the question of shared values, one of the things we should be looking for, not just how do people feel about things, but how are we acting together to make a difference in this world? And I think the idea of working together, liberal Jews in America, liberal Jews in Israel, is a beautiful idea, really joining with the people who we already have on our side and on our team in the way that we need each other in a symbiotic relationship to build on our actions here as we expand the tent of what it means to have pro-Israel dialogue, and also in Israel as well, as we Americans have to teach whatever we have to teach, and then also to learn whatever it is that we have to learn. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. So I just like to, just by way of conclusion, I think what we've heard this afternoon is both, on the one hand, the differences between these two communities, the different values, the different attitudes that they both have, but at the same time, a recognition that in many ways the divide doesn't run between Israeli Jews on the one hand and American Jews on the other, but within these two communities, and that both in Israel and in the United States there are allies on both sides of that divide, and we shouldn't think of these two as monolithic communities who clash over values, but rather that there is really very much of an ongoing debate and argument, whether it's over Jewish values, Judaism itself, Jewish history, both within the Israeli Jewish community and within the American Jewish community. And in many ways, I think as a closing, when we think about communities, community isn't defined by consensus, and community isn't defined by homogeneity or by common values, but rather by the willingness to engage in debate and maybe a shared terms of argument. And so insofar as there's lots to argue about, but we might agree upon the terms of the argument and the willingness to engage in that argument, I think both Israeli Jews and American Jews can still think they have something in common. So thank you. I want to again thank the panelists. Thank you all for being here, and you're welcome to come up and talk to any of us afterwards, so thank you.